Coming up next, Sitting at 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Susan Kelly, President-elect of the City Club, filling in for Patty Tillett, our president, who's vacationing with his family in London. Welcome to another outstanding City Club program. Today we focus on the realities of the energy crisis in the Pacific Northwest. A few announcements. This is our last program for the summer. We will have our 1-month break all through the month of August and then be preparing for our fall schedule. During that time, the office will be closed each Friday at noon, so please do your business the first 4.5 days in August. Be ready to rejoin us on September 7th. We will hear from Dr. Paul Risser on the state of the environment. We will be right here at the MAC again. New members who are present today are invited to join staff and some members of the board in the lounge following the program for a brief orientation on the club and membership. The session will last about 15 minutes, so please plan to join us. We have two new members here today. Harvey Spiegel is an attorney with Preston, Gates & Ellis. Is that right? Maybe not. And we have, hopefully, Seth Eisenberg with Rapidyne Incorporated. Yeah, okay, thank you. For those of you who may not be aware, the City Club website offers access to research reports, past club program presentations, upcoming events, and membership information. Check us out at www.pdxcityclub.org. Our board host today, seated at the head of the table, is Doug Marker, second vice president of the club and senior policy coordinator for the Northwest Power Planning Council, and he will ask the first question of our speaker. Following Doug's question, we'll open the program to questions from City Club members in the audience. Please line up behind the microphone even before Doug is finished so that we have time for as many questions as possible. Please identify yourself as a member and ask your question in 30 seconds or less, and we ask for questions, not speeches. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part by corporate underwriting from CH2M Hill, Providence Health Systems, Weyerhaeuser Company Foundation. We are grateful for their support. And on to our speaker. Our guest today is in the current class, or actually just graduated class, of the American Leadership Forum, which is class 15, he tells me. And I'd like to welcome ALF members and guests, and particularly note that we're the proud co-workers of Nancy Hedin, who was one of the ALF, of course. Bonneville Power Administration is a huge presence in our lives. It is a federal agency under the U.S. Department of Energy that markets wholesale electrical power and operates and markets transmission services in the Pacific Northwest. About 45% of the electric power used in the Northwest comes from BPA. BPA's customers include publicly owned and investor-owned utilities, as well as some large industries. BPA also sells or exchanges power with utilities in Canada and California. Our speaker is Steve Wright, acting administrator of BPA since last November. Prior to that, he spent 10 years as the senior vice president of corporate for BPA in Washington, D.C. In that role, his responsibilities were environment, fish and wildlife, finance and budget, strategic planning, human resources, and public affairs. Now he's just in charge. He's just in charge, which sounds a lot easier.
Thanks. It's a, does this come up a little bit? No, we'll try it that way. It's a pleasure to be here today. So I come here today to answer the question that has plagued investigative journalists across the country for the last 8 or 9 months, which is, so what in the world happened in these electricity markets? How could they have gone so crazy? How could you have had a market that was at $25 to $50 a megawatt hour for 50 years, and last year in May it went up to about $100 a megawatt hour, and it stayed in that range, $100 to $150 a megawatt hour for most of the summer, and then in the fall the prices began to fall actually, and they came down a little bit. And around November 14th, they reached a low. They were back down to the historical levels of around $50. And starting on November 15th, the prices went up. And they went on a ballistic path straight up to $500, $600 a megawatt hour, which is where they stayed through most of the winter and spring. And so there's been a lot of talk about this. Is it manipulation of the market? Is it just the drought? What could it have been that could have caused this dramatic change in the marketplace? Well, under the theory that correlation does equal causation, I can tell you today that there was one single event occurred on November 15th. And for those who are wondering what that is, anybody, John Carr, you know what happened on November 15th that causes? It was the day your now current boss left the Bonneville Power Administration, and I was named the acting administrator. Judy Johansson resigned on November 15th, and I got the job. So fortunately, now you can all walk out of here knowing how to solve this problem. You may wonder how one relatively small person in this agency could have had this kind of impact on the markets. And so let me tell you just a little bit more about Bonneville. Bonneville does serve the states of Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Oregon. We are a not-for-profit federal agency. We market 45% of the electricity that is served to consumers of this region, and 75% of the high voltage transmission. So clearly a big player in this marketplace. We are statutorily dedicated to serving this region, to selling power at cost to the low-cost product, and to providing priority rights to the federal power that is sold in this region to Northwest citizens. We're part of the federal government, but we are separated financially. We have our own fund at the United States Treasury, and we're expected to recover all of our costs through the sale of power and transmission services. We have annual revenues that have been in the range of a little over $2 billion a year. They're going to go up next year. You may have heard we're going to have a little rate increase. We have a $7 billion federal investment in the system, which we repay to the Treasury every year with interest at a rate which recovers Treasury's full cost plus a small percentage. Very important point, because there's a lot of debate about whether Bonneville is subsidized or not. We do repay the federal investment with interest at Treasury's cost of money plus a small percent. So that's where we are, or what we are. This has clearly been a tough year for Bonneville. Maybe the most difficult in Bonneville's history, although Peter Johnson, who was in charge of Bonneville in the early 80s during the whoops days, might argue with me some about that. We've had to contend with a drought. This is the second worst water year in the 70 years of recorded history in the Columbia River Basin. Just to give you a sense of magnitude of that, the average annual runoff in this system is about 103 million acre feet. This year we're looking at about 55. So we're at half the amount of water that we would expect to get in an average water year. We've had to contend for Bonneville, one more thing about that, we are 90% hydro utility. So you take our supply and it's been cut in half, obviously has a huge impact on us. We've had to contend with extremely high wholesale power prices. I described to you a moment ago, prices having gone from $25 to $50 an hour to $500. In a market like this, if you're purchasing, it can drive a utility bankrupt very quickly. We've had to deal with what at best can be called the troubled transition to deregulation in California. And in a year like this, normally what the Bonneville Power Administration and other Northwest utilities would count on is if you have a drought, you assume that you'll be able to import power from California. We deliver power to them in the summer during their high peak season. We get power from them in the winter during our high peak season. With the debacle that has occurred in California, we have been forced to manage to get through this without any power imports from California. So we've had to deal with concerns about fundamentally two critical issues. Reliability. Would we be able to keep the lights on in this region? Was there enough power to go around? And second, financial solvency. If we could buy the power, but we had to buy it at 10 times the cost of historical levels, and certainly what we had planned when we put our rates together, how would we find the money to be able to get through that? There were some really scary days this winter. We reached one point in January where in 4 days we spent $50 million just to buy power to cover loads. And it was clear that we couldn't keep that up for any sustained period of time. But we made it through this winter through a set of extraordinary actions, and I think it's not an overstatement to call them extraordinary. We paid aluminum companies not to operate. Paid them enough so that they could pay their workers, but we paid them not to operate. We paid irrigators not to farm. In the Columbia Basin, approximately 100,000 acres is not being farmed this year because of payments that we made to them in order to get them off the system. We did not implement recommendations for hydrosystem measures that benefit endangered salmon because we needed to pull more supply out of the system. So far, we've been able to keep the lights on, and we've been able to remain financially solvent. But it's been very close, and we've been on the verge all year. We have lost a lot of money. We're probably going to lose about $500 million this year. Fortunately, we entered the year with substantial financial reserves, so we're going to make it through without having a liquidity crisis. But we remain on the verge of a reliability problem. The hydrosystem works in such a way that stream flows come down in the spring when snowmelt occurs, and you store it and then use it for us in the winter when we have the high winter peak season. What we've been trying to do is manage through the summer season to make sure that our reservoirs are in good enough shape that we can make it through the winter. We are close. We think we are in okay shape, but we're very close to the edge. But managing this year was just the first of our challenges. We also had problems with respect to next year. We signed contracts a year ago that committed us to 11,000 megawatts of load, that we would serve 11,000 megawatts of load in this region. But we have only 8,000 megawatts of resources. We reached that point through an exhaustive public process where there was a lot of demand for Bonneville's power. We are a low-cost resource. Folks wanted as much as they could get from us. And what we thought we could do was purchase that extra 3,000 megawatts at the then current prices of about $28 a megawatt hour. At that price, we could have bought that 3,000 megawatts. We could have melded it in with the rest of our low-cost resources. And in fact, we had completed a rate case that came to the conclusion we could do all of that with no rate increase. By last summer, it was becoming clear that that wasn't going to work. As the prices had gone up to $100 a megawatt hour, it didn't look like we were going to be able to accomplish that with no rate increase. By January of this year, it was absolutely clear that we could not acquire that 3,000 megawatts at a low price. By April, we had reached a point where prices were at $200 a megawatt hour for 5-year power products, and we were looking at a 250% rate increase. And just to put that in context, we sell power at $23 a megawatt hour. We were headed towards $80 a megawatt hour. Again, we felt we had to take action to deal with this, and so we took some very strong actions. Again, we went back to the aluminum companies and asked them to curtail their operations and offered them an amount of money to do so. We asked all of our utility customers to reduce their load on Bonneville by 10% for the next year. We told them that we were open to creative ideas about how they did it. We didn't really care how they got the load off the system. They could do it through curtailment. They could walk out and talk to industry, their local industries, and pay them not to operate. They could do it through energy conservation, going and asking people to reduce their energy use through investments, insulation, compact fluorescent light bulbs, whatever it might be. Or they could do it through adding generation, be it diesel generators, which are relatively expensive to operate and are polluting, but in this marketplace are relatively low cost. And the region has responded through an incredible effort, an incredible collaborative effort. At the end of this effort, we managed to get 2,300 average megawatts of load off our system. That's more than 2 nuclear plants worth of energy that is committed, that will not operate and will not require power next year. That load reduction we bought for about $20 a megawatt hour. So again, compare that against the price. If we would have had to go out to the open market at $200 a megawatt hour, we bought it for 1/10 of the cost. What's the result of that? Instead of a 250% rate increase, we're looking at a 46% rate increase for next year. We think the net impact in terms of jobs is 25,000 people that will be working next year that would not otherwise have been working in this region. It's improved reliability. As we walk into next year, we were looking at the potential of loss of load, an outage, a major outage in this region of being about 25%, a 1 in 4 chance. With this load that we've taken off the system, we're looking at about a 12% chance of loss of load. And moreover, we've had a huge impact on the marketplace itself. Market prices have fallen in the last 2 months dramatically, back down to the historical levels. Now, there are a variety of reasons for that, and the load that came off of the Bonneville system is not the only reason, but I would argue it is the most substantial reason. There's some reduction in load in California, some increase in generation, but taking more than 2,000 megawatts of load off of this system in the Northwest, for a 20,000 megawatt system, it's 10% reduction in load. This had a huge impact on market prices. So our fundamental response to both of these crises was to get out of this incredible short-term market. Paying these high prices, as I said before, can drive you broke fast, and there's a great example of it. It's California and what's happened there. And what we sought to do was to seize control of our own destiny, not to complain about what was happening to us, but try to go out there and take actions so that we would be in control of our own destiny. And I think we've been successful at that. It's a perfectly logical short-term strategy, but it is not a long-term strategy. Curtailing loads, which means putting people out of work, compromising our environmental standards, asking people to compromise their lifestyles cannot be a long-term strategy. My biggest concern at this point is that we not respond to what I would call the siren song of things are better and choose not to take actions, the kinds of actions we need to take for the long term. Again, prices are down a little bit. And there's a tendency when prices are down to say, well, things are a little better, maybe we shouldn't worry about this. We cannot afford to do that. The fundamental problem that we're dealing with is supply and demand. And we feel reinforced in this view because we took some demand off of the system and look what's happened to prices. The drought basically unmasked this fundamental supply and demand problem. Previous to this year, we'd had 5 years of relatively good water, average or better water. And so we didn't recognize that what was coming at us was that we had loads growing, a booming economy across the West Coast the last 10 years, and we have not been adding resources. And in fact, if you look at the Northwest overall in the last 10 years, our resource base has declined. We've lost the Trojan nuclear plant. We operate the hydrosystem differently for fish for good reasons, but it has cost us capability in that system. And we've added very few generating resources. What we need is infrastructure investment. And we need it in 4 categories. We need it in generation. Low-cost kilowatt hours added to the system. We don't care how they come, whether they come in the form of thermal generation, gas-fired generation, or wind power, or energy efficiency. Anything that adds low-cost kilowatt hours to the system will help with the supply and demand problem. Second, we need transmission. This is the often overlooked piece of what's necessary here. Transmission, our transmission system is used to the max right now. The throughput on the system has nearly doubled in the last 5 years, and we have not been adding transmission capability. In fact, we have not added new high-voltage transmission in this region for 10 years now. We have to find some ways to be able to move this new generation that will be coming online to load. Third, we need energy efficiency. We've had energy efficiency in this programs in this region. In fact, this region was the leader in energy efficiency programs through the 1980s. We dismantled many of those programs in the mid-1990s. We need to find a way to create a sustainable energy efficiency program that will work through good markets and bad. And finally, we need gas pipeline capacity and storage, because the primary resource of choice in this region is almost certainly going to be natural gas-fired combustion turbines. If you want to build a new resource in this region, you almost have to come to the Bonneville Power Administration because we own most of the high-voltage transmission. And we can see the queue of folks out there, developers that are developing resources. There's some 28,000 megawatts in that queue right now. Again, we're only a 20,000 megawatt region. Not all of that will get built. In fact, we only need a small portion of it to get built. But if you go through that queue, more than 90% of those resources are natural gas-fired. If we're going to depend on natural gas-fired resources to serve our electric power needs going into the future, we're going to have to expand the gas pipeline capacity infrastructure here. Currently, the gas pipeline capacity infrastructure is also used to the max, and what we need is infrastructure development both in transmission capacity and storage. These are a number of difficult issues, and they will take a sustained political will in order to be able to accomplish them. Let me add 3 other issues that I think are important for us to deal with as a region. First of all, implementation of a fish and wildlife plan. We have taken a number of actions this year that have compromised our protection of salmon in this region. We had to do those because we're in our crisis. That is not the right long-term strategy. The right long-term strategy is implementation of the biological opinion that was issued by the federal agencies last year, working with the states and tribes. We need to get on with this because salmon is an incredibly important resource to the people of this region. If we don't take this action, I think that we are at risk of losing the system, because I think it's not only important to people of this region, it's important to people around the country. They look at how we're doing in terms of whether we're protecting the salmon resource or not. And second, because it is, like I say, a critical thing to the people of this region. If we don't take these actions, other actions will be taken which degrade the hydrosystem capability. This is a low-cost hydrosystem that is the foundation of the economy of this region. Taking actions to protect salmon protects the economy of this region. Second, we have to address the question of who is responsible to serve load. As we've gone through deregulation in the electric utility markets, it has become unclear as to who has the responsibility to serve load. Quick example, resource developers come to Bonneville and they say, are you willing to buy our resource for 20 years? And we say we are unwilling to do that because we have contracts that only last for 10 years. We're not willing to make the long-term commitment to you. And they say to us, well, your customers, we go to them and we say, we'd like to sell our resource to you. And they say, well, we're counting on BPA being there to serve us over the long run. Fact of the matter is, resources are being developed in this region, but it's unclear whether they're going to be used to serve the people of this region or not. We have to resolve this fundamental structural problem of who has the responsibility to serve load if we want to be assured that we're going to have these low-cost resources that are being developed to serve the people of this region. Finally, there is a huge issue out there with respect to the formation of what are called regional transmission organizations. I know it is something that is underneath the radar screen for 99.9% of the people in the Pacific Northwest. I suspect when the book is written, the historical book is written about the turn of the century and what was going on in the electric power industry, the West Coast power crisis will be a small paragraph in that book. And the big chapter in that book will be about the formation of regional transmission organizations because it is fundamentally restructuring how the electric power industry is put together, not only in this region but across the country. It's an initiative that's being pushed across the country by Republicans and Democrats. It is strongly supported by the FERC. The fundamental concept is that you can form one regional transmission organization, and in doing that, you will promote interstate commerce so that if you want to move electricity from long distances, you're not crossing many different transmission paths that are owned by different people, and consequently, you're not having to pay the incremental cost associated with crossing each one of those individually owned transmission paths. So it would help interstate commerce. It also, from our perspective, one of the primary benefits for the Northwest is it would enhance reliability. We are increasingly interconnected with the rest of the country, particularly with the West. And as we do so, we have to have ways of looking at the whole grid and being able to manage the whole grid, because if we have outages in one part of the grid, it's relatively easy for it to cascade into other parts of the grid. Reliability, certainly in the new economy, is a critical element, and so we believe moving forward with an RTO is the right thing to do. There are wrong RTOs that can be put together, ones that do not benefit the Pacific Northwest. We believe we need to work together to try to find the right kind of RTO. So let me conclude just to say we have an energy infrastructure in this country which is the envy of the rest of the country, always has been. That's why we have the attacks on the Bonneville Power Administration and federal power in this region, where people argue that the low-cost power of this region should be sent to other regions, or the price should be raised in order to assure that we don't have an economic advantage over other parts of the country. My belief is that if we take strong actions now, that we can determine that we will pass on an incredible legacy to our children, similar to what the legacy was that was passed on to us. Thank you, and welcome to questions.
I was thinking as I was formulating my question in my mind that I want to ask Steve a long-term question, and I'm thinking that he's a guy with acting in his title who's been struggling with nothing but short-term crisis all this time. So I was glad at the end when Steve started talking about the RTOs and some of the long-term issues. But in the coming decade, Bonneville's debt will be starting to diminish with the retirement of the WIPS debt, and the low-cost system that we have will become even more, hopefully on average, a low-cost system. So Steve, my question for you is, with Bonneville being currently a federal agency, should the states of the Northwest again consider the idea of trying to make Bonneville a regional entity, and would there be advantages for the states to do so over the next 2 decades?
Well, Doug, you picked a great question, because I think that really is probably the most critical question for the region with respect to capturing the benefits of the system. So let me start back a little bit just to make sure everybody understands what we have. We have a system that produces 8,000 megawatts at relatively low cost. What does low cost mean? If you compare it against a reasonable estimate of forward market prices across the next 20 years, and not the prices that we've seen in the last year, just the cost of developing, say, a new combined cycle combustion turbine in this region, the value of that to this region is somewhere between $16 to $34 billion. $16 to $34 billion that comes as a result of 2 things: cost-based rates and a requirement that Bonneville sell its power first to Northwest citizens. So the question is, how do you make sure that we capture that $16 to $34 billion and assure that it is preserved for the benefit of Northwest citizens? And there are a couple of different paths that you can take there. One path is to go down the path of the state seeking to buy out the Bonneville Power Administration or the assets that are associated with it, and that way assure that it's left to the citizens of the Northwest. There are other mechanisms for taking this on too. One of them is to try to assure through contractual mechanisms that the benefits stay here in the Northwest. I actually can't say that I have come to a conclusion as to which of those is the best path to go. I believe that the benefits should be kept here. I think that these are the indigenous resources of the Northwest. We should find a way to capture them. I think that's one of the fundamental problems that occurred in California was they sold their resources and allowed the benefits of that system to move to other places. So we need to figure out a way to do that. Whether the contractual mechanism or the state buyout mechanism is the right way, I don't have a strong view on that right now.
Hi, Jane C., City Club member. You, notwithstanding the fact that we have this system to be envied by the world or the rest of the country or something, I guess I would be a little bit more reassured about our energy future if I had any sense that there was some group, maybe in the administration, maybe in Congress, maybe corporately working together to talk about how to do something about the three things that you, well, maybe you were four, but anyhow, the generation infrastructure you mentioned, the transmission organizations, and some sort of a sustainable energy efficiency program. And I'm concerned that you also said that you didn't think we should go about trying to get people to change their lifestyles as a way of doing any of this. I think there's a lot of will to do something about changing things. Is there any entity? Is Bonneville leading some charge here? Or why aren't you if you aren't?
So
maybe that's more than one question.
Yeah, no, actually, I'm going to take it as one question. So I gave you four things that I thought we needed to make progress on in infrastructure. Generation, transmission, energy efficiency, gas pipeline capacity, and storage. And the issue is that in each of those we play a different role, and there is a different leader. So as we have moved, with the 1992 National Energy Policy Act, we moved from a very regulated market, clear lines of authority with respect to who had the obligation to serve, to trying to create wholesale competition and less clarity there, and trying to have the market develop resources, particularly generating resources. My view at this point is in the generation market that Bonneville has a relatively small role to play because, as I've described before, the queue currently of resources being developed in this region is 28,000 megawatts. It's 5 times what we need. So it appears that the market is responding and developing generating resources. So Bonneville's role in that area is small. In transmission, I think our role is huge. 75% of the high voltage transmission, we have to be a key player in order to make this work. And in fact, we put a proposal out to the region for developing some 700 miles of high voltage, 500 kV transmission that we think needs to be developed in the next 5 years in order to be able to assure that we can move these new generating resources to load. In the area of energy efficiency, I think that is an area that Bonneville and the region's utilities need to take the lead on. Although there is a role for government, because in this new marketplace, it has become very difficult for a utility to make investments in conservation. In fact, it puts you at a competitive disadvantage to make investments in conservation. And so there is, I believe there is a market flaw here. And so consequently, I think there is a role for government. The state of Oregon passage of the law with respect to system benefit charge, I think, puts us on the right track there. And finally, with respect to gas pipeline capacity and storage, it's really not a role for Bonneville. We don't do natural gas. Really what I'm trying to do is use the bully pulpit and say we are counting on natural gas-fired resources to serve our electric power needs. Therefore, we need to create an environment that will encourage investment in gas pipeline capacity and storage. There are gas pipeline transmission companies in this region who are proposing just such projects. I'm trying to encourage the support for those projects.
Andy Linehan, City Club member. I'm reading a question from member and former Oregon Public Utility Commissioner Charlie Davis. He says, can you buy photovoltaic cells for installation in homes and commercial businesses with gains made from selling electric power at a premium during times of BPA surplus? Obviously, we're not in times of surplus or available revenues, but is there a role for BPA to fund the development of photovoltaic cells?
Yes, but in a different way than the way that question was phrased. So what we do is when we have any surplus power, we offer all of our power to Northwest first. If it's not taken, it gets sold in primarily the California market, extra regional markets. Any of those revenues are dedicated back to Northwest citizens, and what happens is we use them to lower the rates in the Northwest. So if we were to take the revenues from surplus sales and dedicate to this, it would raise rates for Northwest citizens. But I think that the more fundamental question is there a role here for renewable resources? And I think there is a role for Bonneville in at least a couple of different areas. One is we have dedicated $15 million a year to renewable resources to try to do demand pull, to pull them into the marketplace. The primary place that we are using those revenues to develop resources is with wind. Wind is very close to being cost effective at this point. It's a very attractive resource. We have put out a solicitation and in fact have committed to pursuing some 800 megawatts of wind development in pre-development agreements. So we see a real opportunity there. With respect to solar, solar is further out. It would take a much bigger amount of money to be able to bring solar into the marketplace. We are doing one other thing, though, to try to capture some of these renewable resources, which is we've developed a green marketing program, and we offer it out. And if folks are willing to pay a premium for green power, we take that premium and we dedicate it right back into the development of renewable resources.
Hi, Charlotte Schwartz, Program Committee. You certainly answered a lot of the questions that I had. But I do have another question from Charlie Davis. You are in the transportation business, the farming, irrigation, fish propagation, aluminum production, and electricity production, as well as delivery. Can you tell us how BPA decides the trade-offs between these competing demands now and in the future?
Well, I can tell you how I try to make those decisions,
Okay.
which is I think of Bonneville as a public agency that's here to serve the public good. And the question is, how do we serve Northwest citizens? And we have competing demands amongst Northwest citizens. What I look to resolve that are publicly elected officials. So I spent 10 years working with the Congress. I'm a believer in democracy. And I think that I realize I may not be in the majority of Americans in being a believer in democracy. But I believe that democracy is the right thing, and I believe that politicians actually are trying to do the right thing. And they're trying to figure out how to define the values of the citizens of our region. So when we find ourselves in those kinds of conflicts, we look to particularly the region's congressional delegation and the governors to help us and provide us some advice about how to make these trade-offs that we have to make.
Hi, Steve Hall, City Club member. On June 19th, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, issued a price cap order. They imposed price caps throughout the West, not just California. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how you thought that might affect the development of new generation coming online and how that might affect reliability this coming winter.
Yeah. Well, so it's hard for me not to feel like the FERC price cap order came a little late. I mean, this is 10 days before we announced our rate increase and the conclusion of our load reduction campaign. And so like I say, we had to make some decisions because we had to set our rates. And so we went down that path. Having said that, I think the price cap order is serving to help to keep prices down at this point. I am worried about the future, and particularly the impact on the Northwest, because the way the price cap works is it's set by the California ISO when they're in trouble and when they're in what's called stage 1 and they're closing in on a point of reaching blackout. And the problem that I worry about is that they have a stage 1 in late August and they don't have one until next May. And we have a problem on our system in the winter. And the price cap is set at such a point that we're unable to attract resources into the market. Now, there are some exceptions to the price cap that do allow generators to potentially generate at above the price cap. And hopefully those mechanisms will work. They are untested at this point. And so we have filed comments with the FERC expressing our concern about just how this thing is going to work if we get into difficulty in the winter season. Thanks.
Hi, Seth Eisenberg, New City Club member. I had a question regarding the management for salmon and some of the decisions that were made this year. There's been a lot of controversy about what's impacting salmon runs and whether or not dams should be there or not. But I guess what I was hoping you could speak about would be the impacts that are predicted on the salmon runs based on management this year, particularly with the very heavy runs of Chinook that we've seen, which is probably much higher than average.
Well, we're getting a great run of Chinook, of adult Chinook coming back up because we had good water year a few years ago and good ocean conditions last few years. And certainly, there can be no question about it. Droughts are bad for fish, and we're having a terrible drought, and so the drought is certainly going to impact fish. And the actions that we had to take, in my view, have not made things better for fish. Now, we're seeking to mitigate for that. We've put a couple of programs in place that we're have provided now some $30 million for specific projects on the ground that are hoping to offset some of the impacts of the actions that we felt we had to take this year. Having said that, I think the real challenge here for this region is we knew when we agreed to the biological opinion in December of last year that this was a 10-year program, and it was going to take a committed will on the part of this region to move forward to get the salmon recovery. We had our first meeting this morning with the states, and we're meeting with the tribes this afternoon to talk about the implementation of that program. And for me, that is the key. It is going to take actions by millions of people across this region in order to get the salmon recovery, and trying to create the political will that will allow us to take the extremely difficult actions that we have to take to get us to the point where we can have the kind of salmon run that we had this year on a sustained basis over time is the true challenge for this region.
Thank you.
Bob Shoemaker, City Club member. I'd like to return again to a question that's come up a couple of times, and that's the overall governance of the BPA. It seems incredible to me that you, as competent as you are, and you are the one who makes all these decisions after talking to governors and Congress people. Where else is power centered? There's the Northwest Regional Power Planning Council. What role does it play? Are there other groups that play an important role in helping you make the decisions that are so important to all of us?
Oh, actually, there are tons of folks, and please don't get the impression that that I sit here and make all these decisions in isolation. In fact, this is a hard enough job as it is. That would make it just that much more difficult. So I get lots of input from the congressional delegation. I do have a boss, the Deputy Secretary of Energy and the Secretary of Energy, and certainly do talk to them frequently about these things. In terms of the operation of the system, this is not just the Bonneville Power Administration. We get all the press, but the decisions are actually made by the Federal Caucus, which is made up of the Corps of Engineers, Bureau of Reclamation, National Marine Fisheries Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Environmental Protection Agency, Bureau of Indian Affairs. All of those folks are there sitting around the table as we've had to make these incredibly difficult decisions about how we're going to operate the hydrosystem this year. We do also get a lot of input from the Northwest Power Planning Council. And in fact, I think that works really well, and I'd like to build on that relationship because that's a way for the states to really get into this system and help us with making the long-term decisions, particularly with respect to what's our vision for the power system that we want. We're adding a lot of new resources here. What do we want? All natural gas-fired resources? Do we want diversity in fuel supply? These are the types of things that the council works with us on. So I get plenty of input, let me assure you.
Bob Wheel, member. Two major Northwest utilities have suggested that if we could convert another 200,000 Northwest homes to the use of natural gas for heating and space heating, for water heating, we could save 2,250 megawatts, which is a lot of power. It's been suggested that Bonneville take the lead in this program through its incentive programs and rate augmentation. Would you comment?
Sure. So the fundamental question here is, does it make more sense to burn natural gas in the home as opposed to burning it in a generating plant, shipping it across transmission lines, and then using it in the form of electricity in your home? I think from a social perspective, there's not much question about this. In terms of BTU output and getting the most energy out of, the most use out of the energy that you have, burning natural gas in the home is a more efficient method for producing energy. And moving in that direction makes a lot of sense. The difficulty that we've had is that, first of all, the infrastructure, the gas infrastructure, to be able to get gas to all these places. There's a lot of places in the region that don't have natural gas availability. In terms of us moving towards supporting that, we actually did take a step towards that with this load reduction campaign that we just had in place. We told our member utilities, our consumer utilities, that they could use fuel switching programs as a means for achieving the 2,300 megawatt load reduction target that we were seeking to achieve, and some of them did choose to go down that path. We'll have to see how much further this goes in the long run. In the near term, I want to be clear though, we need some 3,000 to 5,000 megawatts of electricity in this region in the next 3 years. We do not have the gas infrastructure to be able to support that right now. So we are going to have to count on natural gas-fired generation to produce electricity just to get through this short term. It begs the long-term question, though, which is what can we do for the long run to get the most out of our energy?
Can I ask a question from the floor, and then we'll go to your next one? This is a submitted question. So it seems to me currently BPA's viability as a power producer depends on annual replenishment of mountain snowpacks. What do BPA's climatologists tell you about the long-term sustainability of that replenishment?
Well, so that gets to the incredibly difficult question about global warming, and which is the the question of, so to what extent is global warming occurring, and if so, what would be the impact on a small region? And there was I can only tell you that there was a conference on this a couple of weeks ago held up at Skamania Lodge, a lot of discussion about this, and I think that at least the version of that I heard was that it's very hard to come to a conclusion about what the impact on the Northwest would be of global warming. Would it mean more rain in the winter, less snow? And if you were going down that path, what would you do? Does it mean that you would need more storage facilities? Very difficult questions. I don't think that we know enough at this point to come to a conclusion, at least to draw policy conclusions about the types of actions that we would take. Some argued at that conference that we should be thinking about building more dams and doing those kinds of things. Now, that's not going to be a particularly popular option for at least some folks, I suspect. So, but for me at least, it is too early to begin to call that question.
Hi, Steve Hall. I have a question about RTOs.
Yeah.
FERC recently ordered on the East Coast the different RTOs to consolidate into larger RTOs that are more regional. They didn't say anything about the West, but the implication would be that eventually the Pacific Northwest would join with California and with the rest of the WSCC. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, actually, FERC did say a little bit about the West, and they sort of suggested that there should be one West-wide RTO, that there should be 4 RTOs in the country, a Southeast, an East, a Midwest, and West. We have spent nearly 2 years putting together what's called RTO West, which is the northwest portion of this system, extended a little bit beyond our historical service territory. And we feel very good about that effort, and in fact, FERC has applauded that effort and believes that it is one of the models for formation of RTOs. We have some reservations, let's say, about pulling California into that system at this point in time. So, fortunately, the Secretary of Energy and Bonneville did submit comments to the FERC earlier this spring, indicating that we should walk before we run. That what we want to do is try to form RTO West, that it could become the anchor tenant for a larger RTO across the West over the longer term, but that these are not easy issues. I can tell you these are incredibly complex, very difficult issues, which will have real impacts on consumers if we don't get them right. And what we're trying to do is put something together that we think can work. The more parties you bring to that table, and the more problems they bring to that table, the more difficult it's going to be just to get this thing up and running, and we're anxious to try to get it working.
Tom Dunn, City Club member. I have a technical question wanting just a rough horseback guess. And it turns on RTOs. For instance, California drew, a megawatt of power from BC Hydro. That seemed like a hell of a long distance to come. Roughly, what kind of energy loss, occurs when you when you transmit power over long distances, like upwards of thousands of miles?
Probably 7 to 10%.
That's max.
Well, it depends on the distance.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean.
Across long distances, say 500 miles, 1,000 miles, 7 to 10%, somewhere in that range.
Katie King, City Club member, and I want to know, what lessons can Oregon take away from the energy situation in California?
Don't sell your resources. I really do think that is the key takeaway. Maybe a couple of key takeaways, but number one, so you have this system that has been built, an electric power system across this country, in which huge investments have been made, and a lot of those investments were made a long time ago, and so you have relatively low-cost resources out there today. And what California did, from the moment they sold those resources, I think many of us in the industry knew there was going to be a problem because they sold them at more than 1.5 to 2.5 times book value. When you sell a resource at 1.5 to 2.5 times book value, somebody's going to want recovery for the investment that they just made. And the only way they get recovery is from consumers, from selling electric power. So rates have to go up. And I don't see any way around that. So if you start from that assumption, I think the key thing is making sure that the resources that are currently dedicated to load remain dedicated to load. This comes back to Doug's question. So the federal power system is a set of indigenous resources. It's true we're a federal agency, but the resources have been dedicated to the citizens of the Northwest. How do we make sure that those resources remain dedicated to the citizens of the Northwest over the long run so you don't see large price increases? Second takeaway from California was they took all of their energy and they sold it, and then they allowed it to be sold back to them in the spot market. And having 100% of your resource base being sold in the spot market, I don't think any of us would operate our businesses that way, where you would be completely subject to spot. And consequently, when they got into this problem, they had no firm resource supply. Market prices went up, and therefore 100% of their resource base, the cost went up. Mistake.
Jim Harris, City Club member. Steve, what are the major obstacles to increasing the supply of natural gas to the Northwest, and who are the coalitions that are working to overcome those obstacles?
Well, so of the four areas that I talked about that need work, natural gas is the one I know the least about. So let me just be clear about that. I've had some conversation with folks in the natural gas industry just trying to understand the problems, because clearly they are the supplier to us, and so we need to understand their issues. I think the key issues here are just siting of new pipeline capacity into the region. There is a fair amount of new gas that has been discovered in the last year even, particularly in British Columbia and Alberta. On the British Columbia-Alberta border, there's a substantial amount of new gas up there. So the gas supplies are out there. It's a question of getting them to market. And I think the key question there is just being able to move through the certification processes that are necessary to site new pipeline capacity in the region, and then assuring that adequate capital is attracted to make the investment. It appears the capital is out there. From what I've seen, there are a couple of pipeline capacity expansions that have been proposed and auctions that have been conducted, and the money seems to be coming in. So I think that key part is getting the siting and building done.
Carolyn Timmerman, City Club member. I am wondering why the tides of the ocean aren't being considered a source of energy.
Funny thing you should say that. I just saw an article the other day that there's a proposal to build a new Tacoma Straits bridge and to put tidal energy production underneath it as a way of paying for the cost of the new bridge. The fact of the matter is tidal energy is sort of out there right now with solar energy. It is not cost competitive against the other alternatives that are there. What it takes is demand pull. It takes bringing some of these renewable resources into the marketplace with new technology developments. And I think it's one of the things that we need to make sure that government is investing money in research and development, because one of the things that's happening with this utility marketplace, and again I call it one of the market flaws, is as a utility, if you're out there in the marketplace today, it is a real cutthroat industry. And as it becomes more competitive, it becomes more difficult to invest in things like energy efficiency, renewables, and research and development. So finding a mechanism to assure that we will have adequate funding for research and development, I think, is one of the challenges for us as a country.
I'm going to step in with another one of our Charlie Davis questions. I wish we had Charlie here in person, and maybe you're just going to be recovering the same material, but it's along the same vein of alternative sources. Does it make sense to buy transmission corridors and build lines with an irreversible investment decision when we are so uncertain about competing supply, such as wind generation or the tide or some of these others, solar?
Well, the example is a little confusing to me because the wind generators really need transmission. They're mostly in remote areas, and in fact one of their fundamental concerns is that there be adequate transmission for them in order to be able to move their product to market. But I think there is a more general question there, which is with respect to distributed generation and other types of measures that can be installed at the consumer side of the meter so that they are actually reducing the amount of power that they're taking off the system. And is there a question about whether we'll get cost recovery for transmission investments? I'm a big believer in distributed generation. I think that distributed generation will be a major force in the marketplace probably 10 years out. But I think it's still a little ways off at this point. And consequently, I think that, again, we are going to have to meet the electric power needs of this region. And in order to do so, we're going to need new generation in addition to the energy efficiency measures that we're going to take. And that new generation is going to require some new transmission. And I feel fairly confident, in fact, we wouldn't be proceeding with these investments if we didn't think they would generate cost recovery. Feel confident that, in fact, with the new generation coming online, that we can install the 700 megawatts of high voltage transmission in this region with no rate increase, no transmission rate increase. The revenues will offset the costs.
I'm done again. These are not Charlie Davis questions. They're Dan Williamson questions. And I'll ask you both of them because I think they're pretty succinct. Number one, what is the status of your study of nuclear power plants? And number two, now that the market energy prices have dropped, is the 46% increase still justified?
Let's take the nuclear question first. For those of you who don't know, Bonneville was involved in construction of nuclear plants, WMP 1, 2, and 3. WMP 2 is operating. WMP 3 is being dismantled. WMP 1 is still out there in a mothballed state. It's been mothballed since the mid-1980s. Earlier this year, the supply system, now known as Energy Northwest, came to us and said, we would like to conduct a study that would look at the economics of restarting WMP1, pulling it out of the mothballed state and moving forward with it. We expressed some skepticism about that with respect to the viability of the plant. But at the same time, we are in such dire straits with respect to the energy prices that we felt it was worthwhile to at least fund the initial study, which was about $1 million study to look at the economics. But we have also told the supply system that we think that it would take some $4 to $5 billion to complete the construction of that plant, and that we probably are not going to be willing to provide that full $4 to $5 billion, and so we would need a private sector partner to proceed, if it's going to proceed at all. The study is due to be completed later this summer or in early September. There are also, as I understand it, we are not party to this, some discussions going on with private sector parties that may be interested in partnering with this. So we'll have to see how that turns out. I forgot your second one.
Rate increase.
The rate increase, right. We knew when we started this in April that we really had two choices here. One was be victims and sit back and let things happen to us and end up with a very large rate increase. Or two, take some very strong actions, get load off the system, which would probably drive the market prices down, and then lead to just the kind of questions that you asked, which is, so we have paid people now to not operate their plants, and those costs are what drives the 46% rate increase. It's no longer the cost of purchasing power in the market. In fact, we are basically in load resource balance today. We are purchasing very little power in the marketplace. So what the cost of the 46% is the cost of paying people not to operate. Now, we knew when we did this it would subject us to second guessing, that in fact market prices likely would come down and people would ask those kinds of questions. We felt that it was still the right decision to make, that absent taking these actions we'd be looking at the higher prices.
Corleen Craft member, it's good that your speech can inspire double questions, so I have a double as well. It was raised by an earlier question, and that is that since these new power suppliers are actually going to be able to supply more than what you need, I'm just curious about what methods they'll be using, if they're not using solar, or if they're not using wind or some of the others. That's the more technical question. On the marketing side, it seems as if there has been quite a lot of voluntary conservation just on the part of the consumers. Is it out of the realm of possibility for BPA to develop a very catchy little marketing campaign aimed at younger, even kids, and all the way up to get more conservation at the consumer level?
Let me make sure I understand your first question. So primarily what these new resources that are coming on are natural gas-fired combustion turbines. Like I said, it's 90% plus of the 28,000 megawatts in the queue. Does that answer that question?
Yes, I probably spaced out when you said it.
Okay, that's okay. I just wanted to make sure. On your second piece, you're a great straight man. So we are in fact, straight person. So we are in fact initiating a campaign that's going to do just what you're talking about to go out this fall, because we knew when we were talking about a 46% rate increase, for us, we're at wholesale. At retail, that's probably going to translate into 20 to 25% for consumers out there. And that's not a small amount of money. It's going to impact people. It's going to impact people in terms of industry and jobs, and it's going to impact disposable income, and it's certainly going to impact low-income folks. So what we have put together is a program for energy conservation activities, both helpful hints, things that you can do, those kinds of things, but also a broader program that's actually investments that can be made to help bring down energy costs. And in order to market that, part of that program, there's a whole host of activities in the marketing side of it. But part of it is to try to get to school kids. And because they clearly have, at least my kids, have a big impact on me when they come home and tell me that we should be doing things. So we're going to try to get to that market.
Andy Linehan with a question of my own. You talked today about some creative and some brave decisions that BPA and the region have made about our own energy future. But my question is, to what degree is our energy future our own? We're linked to a much larger market in California by a backbone of transmission with far higher demand and a deregulated market structure that sort of encourages region-wide movement of energy. To what extent can we make our own decisions with the California bear to the south of us?
I think that's a great question. So let's say that we take a whole bunch of actions up here and we add 3,000 to 5,000 megawatts of generation, energy efficiency, other things, and we meet the planning targets for our loads, but California doesn't do anything, and so the market is still bad. Well, for me, we still solved our problem, because the key here is that we have supply and demand imbalance in the Northwest. If we do, then we're not in the market purchasing. What was killing us this year was the potential for being in the wholesale market when the costs were $200 a megawatt hour. Once we were able to get these load reductions and we got out of that marketplace, then we weren't exposed to that cost. So as long as we have supply-demand balance here in the Northwest, we're not exposed to that wholesale market. If the market goes nuts, in fact, we are at advantage, because then we're potentially in a surplus situation and can take advantage of it. So I think we can control our own destiny here. But I do want to come back to that second point I made on structural issues. If resources are developed here in the Northwest, but they're not dedicated to load in the Northwest, then we potentially are exposed to the market and can have big problems. Well, thank you very much. I do hope that the City Club will engage in these issues, because I think these are critical issues for our region. And so to the research group, Jane and Doug, I encourage you to engage in these electric power issues as we go forward, and look forward to your advice and encouragement. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Steve, and the City Club is adjourned.